everyone. In this video session, I'll be going over CSS positions. And in previous videos, I've talked about getting set up with VS Code. I've talked about CSS box model. And this is just a review of one of the other basic properties in CSS that handles so much of what you'll be doing when you're building web applications. So I've already gone to GitHub. I've downloaded the project files. Again, the link will be in the show notes. I've installed Live Reload or Live Server, as I've shown you in a previous video how to do. So I have my project files up and running, and I'm just going to jump right in. So I've started Live Server. I'm going to head over to CSS Positioning Sandbox. It's going to take me to a blank page. If you've downloaded the project files, which you definitely should, it'll be easier to follow along. You're going to go to O3 Positioning and open up the index.html file. Nothing in here because we're starting with a blank canvas. And so, like I said, I'm talking about CSS positioning in this lesson. And CSS positioning basically specifies the type of positioning method that you're going to use for elements on your web page. Currently, there are 5 types of positions. So just to show you them real quick, you have a static position, you have relative positioning, fixed, absolute, and sticky. And so those are the 5 CSS position properties that you can use as you're styling and creating elements on your web page that will tell the browser, hey, this is how I want to position these elements. So let's get right into it. We're going to just build a basic demo with a few elements that will best kind of provide an example as to what it looks like when you're working with different position properties and changing stuff around. So I'm going to go ahead and get this basic template started for my index page. Again, because you're in VS Code, you can just type HTML and you'll see like a couple of different tag options that will auto populate a page template. That's one. The one I'd recommend, if I type L again, :5, this one. So now you can see I have a full page ready to go in terms of just the base template that you need to get started with an HTML page. And I'm going to do a few things. One, in that working directory, that working folder, the sandbox, I've already created a style.css file that's also empty. I'm going to link that style file to, or that style sheet to my index page, because in a previous video I showed you how to do styling with inline styles and a declared style block at the type. Now I want to use an external style sheet that we'll kind of be switching back and forth between to really handle some of the styling in this project. So the best way to do that, and the way you go about doing that, is to simply create a link attribute or a link tag that tells your index file and tells the browser where your style sheet is located. So you literally type opening bracket link, rel is going to be style sheet. You're telling that the relationship is a style sheet. Href, which is the hypertext reference, is going to be style.css. As you can see, VS Code automatically finishes that path because it can sense that I'm looking for a file to apply here. And then we're going to close this bracket. So now my style sheet is linked to this. If I go to my browser, you still can't see anything. There's really nothing to see. I'm going to reduce this a bit. Can't really see anything. There's nothing to see here, but let's go to back to my VS Code. Let's go to style.css, and we're going to say the body has a background of red, just because I want you to be able to see. So our style sheet is working. It's linked in our HTML file. And so this is just a super quick, super easy way to start styling elements. So back to positioning. Let's create a parent container. We're going to say class container. Let's say wrapper, actually. And we're going to populate it with 5 boxes because we want each box to represent a different positioning property. So we're going to give them all a class of box because there'll just be some shared attributes that we want all of them to have. We'll say this is, let's put sticky first. Sticky box. We'll go back and let's give it an ID of sticky. Let's do div class box. Let's do ID of Let's do static. Let's make this a static box. Static box. So again, we're making 5 boxes, 1 for each position property, and we're giving them all a class of box because a class can be used over multiple elements, but an ID has to be unique. We're going to make this one relative box, and then div class box. ID equals absolute. Now, these are not typical conventions for like what you would name these elements, but I'm just doing this to just easily kind of give you guys an example of exactly what I'm talking about as I'm doing this. So class box, ID, and let's do fixed. So we have our boxes, 5 boxes, fixed box. That's the last one. Let's go back over to our browser. Okay, cool. So we're gonna give not only the boxes a style, some colors, just so we can kind of easily see what we're talking about. We're also gonna give the wrapper so we can kind of see the border and the boundaries of the parent container, which is the wrapper box. So let's go to our style sheet, and we're gonna say wrapper. We're gonna give it a width of 800 pixels. We're gonna give it height of 1600 because we want this element to be longer than the viewport. Viewport is your actual browser window, just so we can show an example of what happens with the sticky element. We're going to give it a margin, we're going to give it a top margin of 40 pixels and a left and right margin of auto. We're going to give it padding of 50 pixels. And let's say the border is a solid 5 pixel green border. Okay, cool. So we have this so far. Now, let's give all of our boxes, let's give them a width of 200. I can type a height of 200. Let's say a padding of 20 pixels, text align, center. That should, okay, cool. Now, yep, we see these boxes, but we can't really tell them apart outside of the text. So let's give each one a different color. We'll do static. And notice I'm using a hashtag selector because I'm targeting the ID, not the class. We're going to say background. Let's just give this a background of pink. Why not? We'll go to the next box, which is, let's do sticky. We could have done that first, but it's fine. And we'll give it a background of orange. I'm using just color names. You can use hexadecimals, but it's just easier, and I missed that. Sticky, there you go. We'll do relative next. Let's give it a background of green, yellow. That'll work. What else? What did I miss? Absolute. Background of blue. Let's just do blue. And I have static, sticky, relative, absolute. I need fixed. And fixed, the last one. Let's give fixed a background of yellow. Okay, awesome. So, you can see that these elements are by default falling into the box model because they're all made with divs. They're block level elements. So that means they take up even if they don't take up the entire width of their line, because they're not being told to display as inline properties, which would mean sit next to each other. They're all taking up a single level. They're all 200 pixels wide. They all have a different color, so we can know which box it is. So the first box, first position property that I want to talk about is actually static. So that would be this pink box, right? And I want to come here. So the static position property really basically is the default property for all elements on a web page, and it's essentially saying that, hey, this element is static. It's to be treated in no special way. It can't be affected by certain position declarations like top, left, right, or bottom, which I'll show you guys in a second. It's basically the most generic positioning property that there is, and it's again it's saying that there's no special property on this. By default, every property essentially is positioned as static. So if I were to go position, which is the actual CSS declaration that you have to use, and type static, nothing would change. Nothing at all would change, because literally this is how every element starts out, right? In comparison to, let's say, relative being the next box in our list. And I'm jumping around because I want to kind of slowly build up the stack and show you guys what I'm talking about. So every element, even this wrapper, these boxes, all these boxes by default have a static position, or have a default position of static. It's important to understand that when you start changing the position types and position values of elements, you're not only changing how those particular elements are positioned, you're also potentially affecting how elements within them, inside of them, are also positioned. So again, if I were to go to static, this is positioned as static. One of the things, because you're basically telling the browser like, hey, there's nothing special, nothing should be done to this. If I were to do something like this, left 10 pixels, it's a static, nothing happens, right? However, if I come over to relative, and when you set a position to relative, you're basically saying that the top, right, bottom, and left properties can be relatively positioned and can be adjusted. So, other content won't be affected in certain ways as you're moving a position relative element. So let's do that. Let's do position relative, and at face value, nothing really changes. It's still within the flow. We're looking at this relative box, but unlike static, which I added left 10 pixels a second ago, if I come here and do left 20 pixels, now you see it's coming out of the flow a little bit. What if I do left 200 pixels? Even more so. So it's not affecting the other elements in the flow. You're only affecting this particular element, but now you have more power over where you can position this element, because you're saying, hey, this element is relative really to its parent container or the root document, which we'll also get into in a second. So I could even go further and say, hey, 10 pixels. I want 10 pixels from its current position. Now it's moving down. I could also do same thing, 200. So you see it's almost even with this one. So setting an item to be position relative, you start getting into a little bit more manual control over how you can actually position that element and where you'll lay it out in your actual layout. So let's go back and put left to 20 pixels. Let's do that. Actually, let's make it more dramatic. Let's make it 100, just so it's like that. The next item I'm going to talk about is position fixed. And when you're updating position fixed, you're basically saying, rather than positioning this element, because it's currently at the bottom of our stack, rather than positioning it, let's say, absolutely compared to its parent container, which is this box, we're saying that whatever the viewport is, which is your entire browser window, you're going to position this in a fixed position. So it's stuck, it's set in one place in relation to your browser window. So it totally comes out of the flow of whatever else is next to it or near it within the document or within your page structure. And now it's being laid out and positioned in relation solely to your browser window. So let's do that. Let's do position fixed. Let's do top 0. So we're saying move it all the way to the top of our browser window. And let's say left 0. So we're going to see a dramatic change in position. Boom. So what was once at the bottom here is now all the way at the top to the left. Let's move it to the right. Let's just say right 0. So now we're moving it all the way to the right. So again, realize it's no longer in its parent container, this wrapper div. It's positioned fixed totally in relation to the browser window. So it doesn't matter if you widen your window, lower your window, whatever you do, it's still going to be positioned top 0. So there's 0 spacing between the top of your browser window and that element and right 0. So same thing all the way to the right. And this comes in handy sometimes. You've seen it on websites where you see links, navigations, different little elements that may be positioned fixed to the left side, to the right side, to the top, or to the bottom. Sometimes just to make it easier or to call attention to an element on a page. The next element or position type that I want to go over is position absolute. And this is sometimes can be a tricky one to get a hold of. But position absolute it works in tandem with position relative, because you're positioning relative to the nearest ancestor or parent within your page structure. So if I apply position absolute to this one, right? And similar to fixed, I'm going to say top 0. You know what? I'm going to say top 300. I'm going to say right 0. So it looks like it's similar to position fixed, right? Because right now it's all the way to the right of the browser window. It's outside of this wrapper element, and so it's stuck there, right? But really it's not. You see how the fixed position element sits on top of it and stays in view because it's relative to the browser window, whereas absolute is not. It's still really relevant to its parent container. The only reason why it's sitting outside of the container right now is because we haven't set a relative position on the wrapper. So if we go to the wrapper, right, and this is the container holding all of these elements on this page. Basically, it's the box that all these elements sit inside of. If we say position relative on this, and we're not changing any of the left, right, top, or bottom values, we're just letting the browser know, like, hey, this is a relative positioned item. We're going to see this absolute positioned item shift. And now we are able to visibly see, hey, this element is positioned absolutely, but it's positioned absolutely inside of this wrapper element. So not to the browser window like this fixed position box, but only to its parent container. And when you start nesting elements or you have more complex web layouts, position absolute can come in really handy when you want certain things to stay in a certain spot in relation to where they're at in the context of your web page. It can be a little bit tricky to understand, but just know that always be mindful of whatever you're setting position absolute on. You want to be mindful that the parent or the element that's holding it, so the element that it's inside of, typically probably should have a position of relative, so you can better control where this element sits. So let's say I just wanted to move it to the top left of our wrapper element, right? That's the box with the green border. I can do left 0, I'll do top 0, right? And by default, because this is positioned as sticky and static beneath it, absolute and fixed are going to sit on top of these elements. They sit on top of these elements with what is called a Z index, just like this, right? So you set a Z index, and it goes from 0 to infinite number. The higher the number is, the higher priority the element takes. So if I just set this at 10, you're not going to see a change because it's already sitting on top of this, but that will take me to my last element, which is the sticky element, right? So currently this position absolute box has a Z index of 10. Now, sticky is a position property that's come about in the last few years. It doesn't have full support in certain versions of IE, but in most cases, if you use it, you're probably not necessarily worried about that. But sticky is super cool because some of the animations or instances that you've seen on web pages where maybe you scroll and the header or some type of navigation becomes stuck to the top. Traditionally, a lot of that was done with JavaScript or a combination of JavaScript with CSS. And what sticky allows us to do is get that same effect, but purely with CSS. So it's saying that a position or an element will be positioned in relation to the user's scroll position. So a sticky element basically switches back and forth between relative, which is what we're seeing with this box, and fixed, depending on where you scroll in relation to the object. So if I set sticky to position sticky and I say top 0, we're going to see something happen. Now that it has a position of sticky in top 0, when I scroll, so literally when I move this scroll bar and the browser window, the top of it hits that element, now it becomes sticky and it basically becomes fixed. This is when it switches over to being a fixed position. And so it'll stay in view and it'll stay in that position, similar to a fixed position item, until the top of the browser window is no longer touching it, because there's space. There's a couple hundred pixels between the top of the window and where this element is positioned. This allows us to do some super cool things. If you had a header or navigation that when the user scrolled, that's when you want it to become sticky and kind of sit on top of content, you could do some really powerful and make some really cool layouts with this particular property. It makes it super easy in comparison to getting into JavaScript. But as you can see, you see that some of these positions are sitting on top of it, and that's where Z-index comes in super handy. So I want my sticky element to be on top of absolute box. I want my sticky element to be on top of relative, all these things. I'm going to set the Z-index for this element to be higher than the Z-index for absolute. So that's absolute 10. I'm going to set this Z-index to 100. We're just going to go way up there. And now when I scroll, one, it's already on top of it. But now when I scroll, it'll also be on top of the relative box because I haven't set a Z-index for that. So by default, it just assumes that this takes higher priority, which it does because I set it to 100. And now it sits on top of everything. And it's super powerful. So I've walked you through some of the basics of CSS positioning, that being static, sticky, relative, absolute, and fixed. And these are super powerful properties to kind of get a better understanding of and to master and figure out when and where you might use them, depending on if you're creating like header elements or navs or however complex your layout is. As you start building more complex layouts, these are definitely going to be, properties that you're going to be mindful of and you're going to use a ton. So take some time, download, if you haven't already, if you've just been working in your own editor or on the browser or something, download the project files. I've set up a sandbox folder for you where you can just practice. And I'd say just go through the exercise of positioning boxes, play around with the Z-index so you can understand that the higher you set that Z-index, the more that element is going to sit on top of everything else. And just take some time to really get more familiar with CSS positioning and the 5 CSS properties. Thank you guys again for watching 0 to 100 with HTML and CSS. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching this video on YouTube. Please be sure to like and share. And if you're not already, subscribe to the Coders of Color YouTube channel and activate notifications to stay up to date with new videos from the Coders of Color YouTube channel, where I'll be helping everyday people navigate technology, the web, and code. See you later.